Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, and I have a very special guest with me, my own son, Baruch. Baruch, welcome to the Jewish View.
Thank you for having me.
Well, besides having Baruch as a new television star, he does have a very interesting story. He's a student, a senior student, and he was what we call a foreign exchange student. And in the Lubavitch, well, maybe I'll let him do his talking, but he was sent to Sydney, Australia. His friends, like I was saying, really not only went to Sydney, Australia, he had friends all over the world. And he'll maybe tell us about where all his friends were. So in any case, Baruch, when we start off, and tell us about generally the Lubavitch program of what I was just saying about having everybody, all these students all around the world, and give me some addresses, not their street addresses, but some cities where they were sent, and of course the purpose and the mission why they were sent there.
Well, in the Lubavitch system of schooling, you have 6 years of schooling, and afterwards they send you out to help out other programs around the world and other communities. So I was sent to Morristown, New Jersey, and in Morristown they sent out to many communities, to South Africa, to Berlin, to Sydney, and even most places in the US actually. And I got selected to go to Sydney, Australia. What you're supposed to give back to the community is the point of this yeshiva community, of giving back to the programs that you've gone to.
So, all right, so tuning into yourself, what Sydney, now it's very interesting because sometimes I have people come from, even visiting. I remember once in even Vermont, and people never go to these communities, and if they do, they don't even know if there's even Jews there, number one, and what kind of Jewish community there are, number two. So before saying what your mission is, tell us a little bit about the history, a little bit of the Sydney, Australia. Obviously, it's halfway around the world. Hopefully you didn't fall off the end of the world there. And how many people ever have gone to Australia, so they really don't know, and they don't really know anything about the Jewish community, how big it is, how diverse it is, what's over there. Talk about a lot of things, the kosher food, how do they kosher food in Australia, the schools. Give us a little bit of a brief story about what the Sydney Jewish community is.
Well, the Jewish community over there, you have to really go back to how Sydney and Australia came about. I think it was around a little before 1800 that it finally got settled by white colonists. And there was Jews on the first ship. That's documented, of convicts. Some were convicts, and I think even there were some that were soldiers. And they settled down in Australia. And that's kind of the original. You have up north of Sydney in Newcastle, the first shul, Jewish shul, which was founded around 1815. And that was the original Jews came from there. But after mainly World War I and World War II, there was an influx of Jewish, not convicts, but refugees from Europe and Poland, and actually mainly Hungary. There's a lot of Hungarian Jews. And that kind of set in motion when Chabad, the Lubavitcher Rebbe sent down different emissaries and different rabbis to help out the Jews that were refugees. And you really have that, if you come with that understanding of how Australia was formed and how, more it became an international, more of a country on the international stage, you can kind of understand the Jewish community over there. The Jewish community is kind of still developing. It's more after the English and South African, the more Commonwealth countries, more than the U.S. style of Judaism, where they have a centralized synagogue, and all the synagogues are really part of the same organization, and that organization is Orthodox. And so even though people are not necessarily Orthodox, they all mainly go to Orthodox shuls, synagogues.
So there's a more of a traditional now, like I was saying before, traditional Jewish life is dependent on, of course, kosher food. What kind of Jewish person doesn't have so much food? So how do they? I mean, again, you're halfway around the world, and either our food is local, New York and New York area, New Jersey, or from Israel. You see a lot of kosher food. What are they eating in Australia? The meat, for example.
Well, the kosher food it's still developing. And the rabbis in Sydney that are in charge of the kashrus are still trying to get more companies to get on. They're kind of a little 50 years behind the U.S., I would say, where there's not so many companies actually signed on to certification of the of kosher standards, and the a lot of the stuff, like it is imported in from Israel, as same as here in the U.S. A lot of it is imported from Israel, and a lot of it is imported from the U.S. But you do have, I mean, it's developing still. The meat is very good meat, and meat is very cheap there. Kosher meat, actually, meat in general. I mean, there's a lot of sheep in Australia, more than New Zealand, actually, and so lamb is very cheap. Lamb chops are very cheap. And that's actually an interesting thing. Even though the kashrus, the kosher, is not very developed, the meat is actually ahead, really, and the pricing is very good and all that. The dairy, they just actually opened up a new goat cheese. I just found, I went the last couple of weeks I was there. They made it in Adelaide. There's a farms in Adelaide, which is Midwest or Center Australia, and they ship it down then to Melbourne and Sydney, the two Jewish communities. Sydney's more of actually a traditional community. It's not really very ultra-Orthodox. Melbourne's much more Orthodox. And so even what you have a lot more restaurants, kosher restaurants and kosher bakeries in Melbourne, whereas in Sydney there's only, a couple handfuls of kosher restaurants and kosher bakeries. So
but everything's accessible, bottom line. I mean, you can have
it's all there.
You're all eating over here. You're not starving over here in Sydney.
Yep.
Do they do import? I mean, it must be very expensive. I mean, again, it's halfway around the world from America or from Israel.
There's only one true kosher grocery, and that kosher grocery imports most of their stuff. About 3/4 of their stuff is imported from the U.S.
What's the pricing?
The pricing is very expensive, but you have to take in consideration.
Like a shopper like me, I'm always thinking about what prices are.
Taking into consideration that pricing on all goods are more expensive. The cost of living is much more expensive than the U.S. So that,
Give an example of different things over
I mean, gas is about probably, if you translate from liters to gallons, is about $6.50, $7 a gallon. And in general, the cost, I was a student, so I didn't really feel it that much. But the to make do for someone with a couple of kids in the area that I lived, you have to make about $80,000. I mean, that's kind of
average. I mean, like
average, yeah, $80,000, which is a lot higher than here. And so the cost of living is much higher also. So on top of that, the kosher food's even more expensive than that. Than the average price hike. So yeah, it is quite expensive.
Well, sometimes, like people make more money and, the whole average is higher. Now, again, tuning into your mission, being in Sydney, Australia, tell us more about, the school and what you were helping out with different kids.
Well, I was actually in Australia for 2 10-month stints. And the first 10 months I was with 14 other boys my age, and part-time studying on our own and part-time actually helping the community. And that there was different kind of different groups, different things that you can do, different levels. There's many things in a Jewish community to work with. You can work with adults, learning with adults, Jewish education. develop Jewish education or more basic Jewish education. You can do teen programs and anything, the after school programs, and actually dealing in school programs, extracurricular activities. And you could work with very young kids and do programs on Shabbos in synagogue, and you can do all different. There's not that much structure. So you really could pick what you want to do and take it and run with it and develop it and have an effect on people, which is not in every community can you do that.
Yeah, because everything already structured, they don't need the students to come in and do too many things. So tell us about the students you specifically worked with.
So I personally I took on teens. It took me a while to settle down in that area, but it kind of found me. Teenagers and working with teenagers, doing a summer camp and a winter camp, and doing after school programs, and just kind of being a little of a guidance counselor, and the in-between between their parents and them. So a lot of that, which was quite interesting. It was a lot of fun. Some of it was hard, and some of it was fun. Looking back, I gained quite a bit from it. But it was an amazing experience.
So what kind of kids, are they like, well, you say they're a little bit different than American kids, but, how would you describe the Australian Jewish youth? Are they that different, or the same problems? And
I haven't really dealt with, youths or teens, and I know from my own friends and when I was growing up, but it's not that much different. The main difference is, like what I said before, is the infrastructure, is that there isn't that much infrastructure. Even, it's a different schooling system, and they have a different summer, and different winter breaks and summer breaks. It's all, they split it up a lot more. In between semesters, they take 2-week breaks, as opposed to in the U.S., where they don't take that long. And you have, in the summer, there's only a 6-week break, as opposed to our 2.5-month more break. So it's very different, and the infrastructure to help out these kids, not only in the Jewish community, is kind of lacking. Not really sure why that is, but it is. And there's sometimes little hiccups where there's somewhere for someone that is a youth counselor can step in and help out. One of the cases I dealt with was a very close friend. I become friends with these teenagers, not just a strictly business relationship style. I became very good friends with a lot of the teenagers, a group of 15, 20 kids in Sydney. And one of them was going through a bit of a hard time, and just working with psychologists and working with the parents and being the in-between, it was a learning experience for me.
So talk about some examples. Obviously don't give names of people, but tell us about some of your interactions with these teenagers.
Well, we were, me and a good friend of mine, Abi Roskin, actually, we were sitting around discussing, what was happening and how it was about 9 months since we got there, 8 months since we got there. And he turned around to me, he's like, there's no winter camp. They have 2 weeks, these kids, and there's not much for them to do. They either could be counselor in day camps, we're talking about 15, 16, 17-year-olds. So he turned to me, he said, what did you think about making a winter camp? This is a month before the winter, month and a half before the winter. So I said,
saying the winter and the summer.
Well, yeah, it was...
the Southern Hemisphere.
It was July, let me say.
See, if they describe that around here, July is no winter camp, but all right.
So he turned to me, this was in June, early June, turned to me, what do you think? I said, you're crazy. I said, there's a lot of things to figure out, transportation, where you're going to do it. He wanted to make an overnight winter camp. So he's like, he started bouncing ideas off me with me dragging my heels a bit. And then I got into it, and we decided that we were going to make a couple of days a day camp more, where they go home at the end of the day in Sydney, and then we were going to go down south, a 3.5-hour drive to Canberra, and then outside Canberra, 2 hours. There's 2 hours out southwest of Canberra. There's snow mountains, and many of these kids have never seen snow, never been in freezing conditions, below freezing.
Just, I mean, maybe to tune in, not that I know that much about Australia altogether, but I mean, I always think of it as, you know, it is an island, so you think some little dinky island, but what is Australia? It's just almost as big as the United States?
I think it's
like
2/3 the size.
2/3, it's very big, so you think of some little island, you know, an island, what's an island, you know?
Well,
a few miles by a few miles, but you know, so they're obviously just like United States. You go from freezing cold to Miami Beach it's one country. So obviously Australia is a big country also.
well, most of the actually civilization, may I say, is around the coasts. Wherever it is, it's around the coast. It's not right in that big outback in the middle. So even Perth, which is on the west coast of Australia, is, you know, it's right on the water, and Adelaide's on the water. You can go through all the big cities, really, around Melbourne, Sydney, Newcastle, which is where I went for Passover this past year, not a big city, Brisbane, Darwin, Townsville. Any of these cities are on the coast. So you kind of, even though they're far away, Perth is, I think, a 7-hour flight from Sydney. You know, they're on opposite sides. Even though they are far, you know, Melbourne's 10-hour drive from Sydney, and you have, you know, Brisbane's another 10 hours north. So it's far, but they're kind of all, I mean, you have Sydney, Melbourne, they're all kind of. So we went to Canberra, which is 3 hours. They made a compromise, supposedly, as the tale goes, to where the capital of Australia should be. Sydney wanted it and Melbourne wanted it. So and they made a compromise and they put it in the middle. There's nothing happening in Canberra. Absolutely nothing. You know, a couple of museums and the Mint. But there's some beautiful science museum. So we spent Shabbos over in Canberra, which was a lovely, the Chabad emissary that lives there used to be a former DJ.
Really?
So all the teenagers really loved him and heard his experience and how he came to become a religious Jew. And that was a very interesting Shabbat that we had there. And then we went on Sunday that we developed this plan that we were going to go to the snow mountains. And I think about half the kids had never seen snow before, which was quite, for me, growing up here in Albany, was quite interesting. And I was telling them, you know, what clothes to wear, that they shouldn't get too cold and too wet. And they're all looking at me, and I was like, I don't really know that much. I haven't been in snow, but it was a very, and then that came to fruition. We really put that together, and that was an amazing experience, and all the parents really thanked us for that. It was only a week camp, but it took a lot of planning and a lot of working, and I didn't think I could do it at the beginning, but in the end it worked out, and it was a very great success.
So you filled in. So that's it. I mean, just from the parent and teacher's point of view, I mean, they are students, they are young, and they're getting an incredible, almost like an orientation into leading a program. So it's really important because, you know, listen, kids grow up, and therefore, you know, these in Lubavitch or anywhere, when you have young students lead the programs like that, eventually they will go into their own communities. And, you know, all right, they're a few years older. Now you're the rabbi of the community. They're already experienced in how to build up a program for youth or for adults. And it's incredible experience for them to be able to, you know, start off. And now they have that, like I say, under their belt, they have to build up a camp and a school and a adult education program. So it's good in so many ways. It's good for the kids, but it's good for the teachers also.
Yeah, I think the system in that way that sends out these, if you want to call us an exchange student, where we were learning, sends us out to different communities. I was speaking to some other friends, and that went to different communities, and they were saying that really, they took it on, and they've developed relationships with the communities where they went down to, and they've really took the bull by the horns and developed themselves and helped out the community. I mean, that automatically happens when you're not focusing on yourself at that point. A lot of times you don't have much time of the day if you're running 2 different, 3 different programs at the same time. You have all the people that you actually learn with on a weekly or daily basis, in chavrusas or in, partner one-on-one learning. And you don't have much time for yourself, but you look back at the end of like 6 months or 10 months, and you're like, wow, I did that much. I accomplished that much. I've developed that many relationships. And you really look back at the end of now 2 years for myself. And I look back, and it was an amazing learning experience for me. I wasn't actually sure whether I should go back, I wasn't really sure about my second year. And I had many doubts whether I should go back, and it was far away. I mean, I didn't come home in the middle. It's a 10-month stint, and I wasn't sure. I came back for 3 months. Wasn't sure if I should go back for another 10-month stint. And I was discussing it with my father, and I was discussing it with my rabbi there in Sydney. And I came to the conclusion that for myself to gain more for this past year, that where I would gain more is if I was focusing on myself or I wasn't focusing on myself. And I came to the realization that I really would gain more if I went back to Sydney to help out the community. And even though maybe I wasn't putting in that many hours to learn on my own and developing my own learning, trying to get my rabbinical ordination, even then I think it would help out my not necessarily was it quantity, it was more quality. And that really helped out. And I definitely will say I do not regret my decision.
All right, so talk about yourself also. What kind of learning, what kind of yeshiva higher learning was going on there? You weren't just working with the youth.
Well, this past year I was at the culmination of about 7 years of learning, of developing my skills in Talmud and in different Jewish texts in the Code of Jewish Law. The last part is you study a specific parts of the Code of Jewish Law, and then you take some very hard tests on this material. So while I was running a lot of programs, which I didn't really lessen the amount of programs that I did, while I was doing all these programs, I needed some intense learning. So you learn one-on-one with a partner, someone my age, and it's really hard, intense. I was speaking to someone from college, and from a regular college, to really just gauge my own how intense I was studying. And we learned for about 4 to 6 hours a day, depending on how much time we put in. And you have a rabbi that's sitting in the room with you, and you go over to him and ask him phrases or questions or concepts. But you're really on your own. I mean, it's in Hebrew and Aramaic, and you've developed all that over the last 6 years. So basically you have the understanding, but you need to then take it a further step and be able to deduce from the text different law. And it makes it a little harder because it's in Hebrew. It's not as easy, it's not my first language. It's my second language. So you have to really stay on your game and keep on plugging away. It's not like you can just show up to class and fall asleep in the middle. It's up to you. If you want to learn. If you don't have to show up. So it's really on you very much, and you have to learn hard. It's quite intense.
Yeah, with a foreign language also. Even these kids have been learning since, 3 years old, the Hebrew language. But still, it is a second language. So I mean, so you learned, and what about community learning? You said with the high school students, but did there any adult learning? I mean, did people came in after work at night?
Well, that's very interesting, because there wasn't much when we got there. There are some things that were developed from years previous and from guys my age that previously ran programs, but there wasn't many in the adult learning. There was many more kids programs developed already, and actually the first project that I took on was to make an adult learning night and to set up my friends and myself with other adults, trying to get them coming in before work in the morning, after work, in middle of work, on the weekends, whenever I could get a chance to get them to, and I would have, they could have their pick of whichever guy they wanted, and really tried to develop that. And over the last, it was one of the most difficult tasks I took on. But one of my best friends and people that I'm closest with in Australia was my first chavrusa, my first learning partner, a 29-year-old, who we learned twice a week, or 3 times a week even, for the last 2 years. And maybe we spoke a lot and learned a little less, but that was for 2 years, and that was very intense. And now, I mean, I still speak and learn with him once a week about.
Over the phone now?
Over Skype.
All right. Well, Baruch, we're out of time. You have a lot of interesting stories that you're telling in Australia, and just even informing us of what Australia is and the Australia Jewish community. We never got to your visits around to the other communities, so we may have to call you back and talk about that also. So still you have even more stories. But in the meantime, I think it's very informative. I mean, here we're in New York, and I think most people go to New York City, they see the Jewish community, they don't know if there's a Jewish community anywhere else in the United States, let alone the whole entire world. I've never been in Australia, but there's Jewish communities everywhere, and we see it a little bit more difficult, but it's to live out there. And we didn't talk about the visits that they connect, maybe their foreign exchange, they come to New York, so there's still more to talk about. We can touch upon that also. The Jewish experience of being in New York. We're so close to New York City, we don't appreciate, the Jewish communities that we have near there, and can see so much Jewish life in New York City. In any case, there's it's an interesting look, a peek into the world around us, and I thank Baruch, my son, for, first of all, your good work 2 years in Sydney, Australia, but of course, glad to have you back, and we have to talk about your future also. So thank you very much, Baruch, and thank you everybody for viewing The Jewish View.